Hello LHS staff once again. If you're watching this video, that hopefully means that you've just finished taking the truth versus myth quiz found on the previous slide. Hopefully those questions didn't stump you too much. This presentation is meant to give you an introduction to the three main types of eating disorders that we'll be discussing throughout the rest of our online lesson today, as well as within our professional development meeting on the 22nd. We'll be focusing on anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. Slides 22 through 25 provide websites that give additional information on each type of eating disorders, as well as on eating disorders in general. After this presentation, please make sure that you go through those websites extensively in order to learn more about each type of eating disorder, so that you'll have a general understanding of eating disorders and the three main types before we meet face-to-face on the 22nd. We're going to dive right into our group activity, as I've previously mentioned before, so you need to be able to have a general understanding of eating disorders and the three main types of eating disorders before you meet us face-to-face. Without further ado, let's move on. Before we talk about each main type of eating disorder, we need to have a general understanding of what eating disorders are in general. According to the National Eating Disorders Association webpage, eating disorders include extreme emotions, attitudes, and behaviors surrounding weight and food issues. The three main types of eating disorders are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder. Binge eating disorder has just recently been identified as a diagnosable eating disorder. It was identified as a diagnosable eating disorder in 2013, and we'll learn more about that later on in the presentation. Let's start with anorexia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa is a life-threatening eating disorder characterized by self-starvation and excessive weight loss. People with anorexia nervosa tend to see themselves as overweight, when in actuality they're underweight. They look in the mirror and they see somebody who is overweight, who is too fat, too chubby, too whatever to them, and they starve themselves and they restrict their food intake in order to get themselves down to a weight that they believe is healthy. They constantly weigh themselves, and as previously mentioned, they restrict their food intake. They eat very little in order to get down to that weight that they want to be at. Approximately 90 to 95% of people with anorexia nervosa are women, and this eating disorder has one of the highest death rates of any mental disorder out there. This next slide gives you three pictures that depict anorexia nervosa and what that looks like. This first image is of a girl on the beach who apparently has anorexia nervosa. You can see her bones through her skin, and she is very, very thin. I chose this second image specifically because of what it says on her shirt. People with anorexia nervosa, as we've already talked about, restrict their food intake, and they don't eat a lot because they think that they are fat or that they are overweight. And as you can see here, you can see this woman's ribs through her stomach, and her shirt says, "I won't eat, I'm fat," which is a typical characteristic of somebody who has anorexia nervosa. This third image on the upper right shows what people with anorexia nervosa see in a mirror. As we've already talked about, they look in the mirror and they see somebody who's way overweight, when in actuality, they are underweight. This woman is severely underweight. You can see her bones through her skin, but she sees somebody who's overweight. So what she sees is what she goes on, and this image drives her actions and her daily behaviors. Moving on to bulimia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is a life-threatening eating disorder characterized by a cycling of binging behaviors such as self-induced vomiting, designed to undo or compensate for the effects of binge eating. People with bulimia nervosa tend to have repetitive, habitual episodes of eating large amounts of food, of which they have no control of doing. They have a lack of control over this binge eating episode that they frequently and repetitively go through. So after they binge eat, they compensate for that behavior by vomiting, by using laxatives or diuretics excessively, or a combination of both. They compensate for overeating by throwing up, making themselves throw up, and excessively using those laxatives or diuretics. Unlike anorexia nervosa, sufferers of bulimia maintain a healthy, normal weight. And this is something that you should understand in order to identify anorexia nervosa as a separate eating disorder than bulimia. Anorexia nervosa sufferers are way underweight, as we saw through the image of this lady on the beach. People with bulimia maintain a healthy or normal weight. So that is something that you can remember in order to help you identify anorexia nervosa as separate from bulimia. Our fourth bullet point also brings up an important point, that there are two types of bulimia. There's a purging type and there's a non-purging type. The non-purging type of bulimia sufferers do not purge their food after they binge eat. They do other compensatory behaviors such as excessively exercising or dieting in order to make up for their binge eating, but they do not make themselves throw up. Bulimia affects 1 to 2% of adolescents and young adult women. These images are meant to give you additional information about bulimia nervosa. In the upper left-hand corner, we see a woman who has a lot of plates of food, and this is what a typical binging episode may look like for her. You can see the clock in the right-hand side of the image designates that she eats at precisely 12 o'clock. Bulimia nervosa sufferers binge at a specific time during the day. It's repetitive, it's constant for them, and once that time hits, it's time for them to binge eat. And like we said before, it's out of their control. It's something that they understand is wrong, but they cannot control it. So after they binge eat, you see the orange arrow goes down to the toilet. For the purging types of bulimia nervosa sufferers, they will either self-induce vomit or they'll take laxatives or diuretics to get rid of that calorie intake that they just consumed. On the right-hand side of the page are two more images. This first image reflects a woman binge eating and then purging. So this depicts a purging type of bulimia. And the last image in the bottom right-hand corner depicts what goes on in the mind of somebody who has bulimia nervosa. You see the media tells her what she needs to be like, what she needs to look like. She's weighing herself. She's excessively exercising. So this might be somebody who's a non-purging type of bulimia nervosa sufferer. So she doesn't purge her food. She might excessively exercise and weigh herself. And this last thought bubble that she has reflects the similarity of somebody who has anorexia. She looks in the mirror and she sees someone who she believes is overweight, and so that drives her further actions and behaviors. Our final eating disorder that we're going to talk about is binge eating disorder, or BED. BED is a life-threatening eating disorder characterized by binging very quickly to a point of discomfort that the individual cannot control. So far it sounds very much like bulimia, except we take out the purging part. We take out the excessive dieting, the excessive exercising. We take out the excessive use of diuretics. This is mainly just the first part of someone who has bulimia nervosa. They just binge eat and they cannot control it. And this is separate from bulimia. People with bulimia do both. They binge eat and they do a compensatory behavior. People with binge eating disorder just binge eat. And again, they know that it is wrong, but they cannot control it. People with binge eating disorder tend to eat unusually large amounts of food in a specific time range, similar to people who have bulimia nervosa. They eat alone to avoid embarrassment or judgment. They eat a large amount of food, a very large amount of food. And they diet frequently, but they typically don't lose any weight because of the repetitive and the frequent binge eating that happens that they cannot control. Binge eating disorder was just recently recognized as a diagnosable eating disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5 that was released in 2013. Please bring your attention to the very last sentence in red on the bottom of this slide. Binge eating disorder is the most common eating disorder in the United States. It's the most common. It beats anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa in terms of commonality. It affects the most amount of people who have an eating disorder. These three images depict what binge eating disorder looks like. Our upper right-hand image reflects a woman who is sitting in front of her refrigerator just eating whatever she likes. This might be a typical binging episode for somebody who has binge eating disorder. The bottom middle image depicts a plate of food that is a large amount of food. And this might be what a person with binge eating disorder eats in one binge eating episode. The upper right depicts a person who is eating but is also chained to his or her food. This represents the lack of control that people with binge eating disorder and bulimia nervosa have over their binges. They can't control it. And I want to make a point that they understand it's wrong. They know that it's not what they're supposed to do, but they feel like they cannot control the urge to eat and eat and eat to a point of discomfort. And people with binge eating disorder, they don't participate in those compensatory behaviors. They do diet, like we previously mentioned, but they tend not to lose weight because they just come back to the binges. So what's next for you? We've just learned about the 3 main types of eating disorders. As we previously mentioned, go ahead and navigate through the websites on slides 22 through 25 to learn more about anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorder before checking your truth versus myth quiz answers on slide 26. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I hope that this presentation was very informative for you, and I hope that you learn a lot more about eating disorders on the websites found on slides 22 through 25. Thank you very much.